Hi, I'm Mal from the Money Study, bringing you another episode in our Take 10 challenge, up to number 15, all about basically having a bit of an emergency fund set up, something that you can call on when something really nasty goes wrong, which life tends to throw those sort of things at us far too often. Anyway, before we kick off with the information, there's my disclaimer. It's all about facts, it's about figures, it's about information, it is not advice. Okay, the emergency fund, or some people just call it a rainy day fund, but I'd rather think of this more as an emergency fund. And so, literally, it is for an emergency. And so, something happens completely out of the blue, totally unexpected, and you go, "Oh my gosh, where's that money going to come from?" We say, "Okay, we need to dip into our emergency fund." And so it's therefore unplanned expenses, and we'll sort of explain the little bit differences in a few minutes here. But it could be you just lost your job. Yeah, that's certainly not pleasant, and can certainly income has dried up. And if you don't have income protection, which we'll talk about insurances in later sessions, obviously could be problematic if you haven't got some money to fall back on. Obviously, a medical emergency, in the case that if you're not covered by all of the health insurances and Medicares and so forth, and obviously it's got to be done, then we need some money for that. And of course, it could be something as simple as your car breaking down, or the engine falling out on the road. Um, but the idea is that buying your new toy, just because it's a must-have. Oh, God, look at that! I've got to get that. No, that's not an emergency. You might think it is. You might, gee, I've got to have that. That's, gee, wow, wow, look at that, and it's even on special. No, that's not for an emergency fund. That's going to come out of another savings account, which is your fund account, the money you're putting aside for those things that you really must have. But the idea is that if something goes wrong, we don't have to borrow money. And this is the situation I come across to see far too often, is that people just start to get ahead, something goes wrong, so what do? They redraw, dip into their credit card, going backwards, and they just feel like they're never getting to square one. You've got to get this emergency fund up so that when these things do happen, we're not dipping into our debt and going backwards and backwards and backwards. I've had that many people who come to me in their late 50s or so, really planning towards retirement, and they say, "I've been paying this mortgage off for years," and and you look at it, and yeah, they just keep on pulling money out and pulling money out. No, that was an emergency. That was an emergency. That's an emergency. Oh, I'm thinking, gosh, these people have a lot of emergencies. So it's emergency fund is indeed for emergencies. Now, the general rule of thumb, and I went looking for this to see what people sort of suggested what was a rule of thumb. Some were saying 1 month to 3 months, some were saying 2 to 4, and I really believe that you should have at least a bare minimum of 3, but ideally 6 months. And what I'm talking about here is 6 months of living expenses, so not your salary, just what does it cost you to live, so you can pay all of your bills for at least 3 months to 6 months and wouldn't have to worry about it. That's to me is an emergency fund. 1 month, look, nah, I just don't believe that that's sufficient. A lot of things can happen where you've got insufficient income for a month, or even one bill could certainly be more than your monthly income or something like that. So yeah, try and aim for something a bit bigger than a month, but ideally 3 to 6 is what I think that you really should have. Um, and of course, it's a case of if how do we get the money in there? It's really, if any time that you've made a savings, if you just were going to buy something but you got it cheaper, put that extra money aside, put that into your emergency account. If you get a little bit of a bonus or a pay rise or something, take some of the money, the extra money that you weren't expecting as such, and get that into your emergency fund. Now, in a previous episode, we talked about an offset account, and that was one of the reasons why I did it in that order, is because an offset account can indeed be an excellent place for an emergency account, providing, of course, that you don't just pull the money out. So the idea is that if you put in, your 3 months worth of expenses into your offset account, then label it, so to speak. Write it down to say this is the amount of money that's in my emergency account for my emergencies. And if you've got another 10,000 in there because you've been using the offset accounts cleverly and smartly, that you can redraw that 10 for other things. Ideally not, but we're not going to dip into our emergency account just because it's in our offset account. So it's a case of it's in the offset account. Yep, it's a bit tempting, and ideally we always want somewhere where an emergency fund where we can get it, where it's liquid and it's available and low risk, which effectively an offset account ticks all those boxes. We can get the money out quickly. There's no drama in that. And of course, it's low risk because it's against a debt. There isn't effectively the risk on it where we would have in other investments and so forth. But as I say, it's the temptation to spend it is the downside. Now, of course, emergencies are supposed to be something that we could never anticipate. I mean, we might have thought they might happen, but we don't really expect them to happen. So, the idea here is to eliminate anything that you really think could happen, in which case it's not really an emergency. So if you've got a really old car, and it's going to break down, well, then that's a known emergency, so to speak. So we should be planning for that outside of our emergency fund. The emergency fund is for things we just don't know what's going to happen. Got an old car, yep, we really should be putting money into a car account and have money trying to either replace your car or have money ready to repair it and so forth. If you've got poor health and you think, gosh, yeah, pretty sure I'm going to have to get that knee or hip done, or I'm going to have a root canal done in probably 18 months' time or something, whatever it may be. If you know it's going to happen, that's not an emergency. It's a case of planning ahead in that 18 months to make sure you get enough money for that, as well as having your emergency in case something else happens. Because as when something horrible happens, 2 or 3 other things will happen all at the same time. Murphy's Law will slice you down, that is for sure. And things like, back to school fees. I've had far many people say, my expenses were really tight this year because we had all those things gone back to school. Well, you knew last year that was going to happen. You survived last year. So to say that was an emergency, no. And the same thing, with what I spent on Christmas. If Christmas is going to put you into a state, you're spending too much money on Christmas. Don't try to be that Mr. Nice Guy by giving wonderful, lavish presents if you can't afford it and you're putting into debt to do it. Talk to your loved ones, talk to the ones, and basically, there's no point in getting yourself into an absolute dilemma, to effectively give money away. Now, it's obviously a very, what a nice person, generous person you are, but you're also stupid in that regard. And of course, holidays, and a tax liability, you've done something, there's going to be a bill, you've got a little side hustle, you don't put any money aside for tax, or when you finally do your tax return for this extra income, you get slugged and you go, oh, where am I going to find that $5,000? That's not an emergency either. You should have been planning, you should have understood with your little side hustle as to what money and what tax you would have to pay on the money. And of course, if we dig into our emergency fund, because we did indeed have an emergency, we can go, it's an absolute, I wouldn't say it's delight, obviously you've got an emergency, but by the same token, if you know this has just happened, you go, well, at least we've got our emergency fund, and so it takes the stress away from the emergency, literally because you know how in the hell you're going to pay for this problem. But of course, if you do use it, then we really need to replace it ASAP before emergency number 2, 3, and emergency number 788. And of course, as your expenses change, as your income and so forth change, as your whole situation changes, then you just got to keep on reviewing your emergency fund to see, is it still appropriate for our current situation. Get that emergency fund going. There is a sort of a quandary if you do have debt. Do I get out of debt first? before I establish an emergency fund? I think it comes down to the type of debt and the level of debt, in the regard that if I had $10,000 on a credit card and I was paying 20% interest on that, well, yeah, you've really got to get that credit card paid out, because you're never going to be able to afford to build up an emergency fund, because you're paying so much money in interest on the other side. But if you had a mortgage and so forth, then really it's a case of making your regular payments on the mortgage, build up with spare money, and this is, we're trying to find some spare money everywhere here, to build up an emergency fund, and then later on, once we've got the emergency fund, that extra money we're putting to build our emergency fund, we can now, plonk in either to pay our loan down or build up the offset account. So, it just takes a little bit of considering your overall situation there as to which way you would play it. But I tell you what, having an emergency fund is certainly something that everybody should indeed aim to have. We'll talk again on a future episode.